We're certainly still waiting on the Orioles to make that big splash so far this offseason, but the O's did make a couple of depth moves over the past week or so. We'll get to those, plus update you on the most recent Orioles and Dylan Cease rumor coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Friday, January 5th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are going to get to a couple of minor league signings that the Orioles have made over the past week or so, as they brought in a potential backup or even third catcher in Michael Perez, who has been bouncing around the big leagues since 2018. And they also went out and got another arm in Albert Suarez, who could be interesting as a depth guy in AAA and in the majors. And then couple more pieces of news, including Ken Rosenthal writing a little bit about the Orioles and Dylan Cease on Friday. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. So today, little Orioles news and notes episode, couple of minor league signings that the O's have done over the past week or so that just haven't gotten to yet on the podcast, but they're two guys who at worst will be in AAA Norfolk for most of the season for the Orioles, and two guys with certainly, I would say, a chance to appear in a game for the Orioles at some point in 2024. There are very much differing levels of minor league signings when you see guys come in on minor league contracts. But I would say for the two guys we're going to talk about today, Perez and Suarez, I would be willing to bet that at least one of them plays for the O's next year and potentially even both of them. So even more worth it to kind of talk about these two guys here on a Friday episode. So let's start with Michael Perez, the left-handed hitting catcher who the Orioles brought in on a minor league deal with an invite to big league spring training in February, and we're just over a month away from that, which very, very exciting, at least just over a month away from pitchers and catchers reporting. But let's start with Perez, who has been in the big league since 2018. While he has never been anyone's starting catcher in that stretch, he spent a solid amount of time in a big league uniform. Perez, a left-handed hitting catcher who's now 31 years old, who was a Arizona Diamondbacks fifth-round pick out of Puerto Rico all the way back in 2011. He bounced around a little bit in the minors, made it to the Rays, got to the big leagues with the Rays in 2018, and has appeared in at least one big league game in every season since 2018. Now, 2023 was his least time spent in the big leagues since his last full minor league season, which was 2017. He played only 3 games in the bigs for the New York Mets last season. Now, he did go 4 for 8 at the plate in those 3 games, which is pretty good sign. And he demolished the ball. He only had 1 strikeout in those 8 plate appearances, which is hitting the ball all over the yard. But I would say that's a little too small of a sample size to really take anything away from it. Meanwhile, he spent most of the year as the catcher in AAA for the Mets with the Syracuse Mets. And that didn't go as well at the plate. 270 plate appearances. Perez hit just 204 with a 66 WRC plus. Remember, that means he was 34% worse than a league average AAA hitter at the plate in 2023. Not great. Now, in 2022, he made a little bit more of a big league impact. He started the year with the Pittsburgh Pirates and then was traded to the Mets at the deadline in 2022. And although he played more with 132 big league plate appearances, the offense was not good. 149 average, 42 WRC plus, and a 0 defensive run save, which means he was basically league average defensively as a whole behind the plate for the Mets and the Pirates that year. Now, the last time, and really the only time we've seen him play close to a full-ish big league season, at least a solid sample size season, is probably 2021, when he spent the entire year with the Pittsburgh Pirates. He played in 70 games, was essentially the Pirates' backup catcher in 2021. Played in 70 games, got 231 plate appearances, but again, just really no offense to speak of. Hit just 143, had a 36 WRC plus, but it was by far his most MLB playing time ever. Now, the interesting part was When he first came up to the Rays in 2018, they called him up to be the backup catcher. He was sitting behind Mike Zunino, and there was one other catcher in there. He was the third catcher to start the year, but had some time as the backup. I wouldn't say he was a good hitter from 2018 to 2020, the 3 years he was with the Rays. He was kind of bouncing up and down between the big leagues and AAA Durham as basically the third catcher. Whenever a catcher gets an injury, Perez would come up, play for a bit, and go back down. But he had really good hard hit rates, good barrel rates. He wasn't swinging and missing a lot, and he was playing solid defense. He was like an ideal third catcher and a guy who, if he became your backup, you were fine with it those first 3 years with the Rays. But since he went over to Pittsburgh in 2021, it just hasn't been the same kind of player offensively. He was much closer to league average with Tampa. He has not been that at the plate. But the good thing for the Orioles is they're signing Perez to a minor league deal, and unless there's an injury, there is no expectation for Perez to really have a role with the O's next year. I would say the catching position, and it's easier to do this because catcher is just two players pretty much on every big league team. The catching position is more locked in than any other part of the Orioles roster at this point. Adley Rutschman is a star. He is an all-star. He's going to continue to be an all-star, and he is the starting catcher for the Orioles. And they brought in James McCann as their backup, traded for him last season, had 2 years left on his deal. And McCann is a free agent after this upcoming 2024 season, but he's a good veteran who I think did a great job as the backup last year, and that is his job in 2024 as well. But one thing that did happen with McCann last year is he had 2 different stints on the injured list. Now, luckily, Adley Rutschman has really not dealt with any injuries so far in the 2 years he's been in the big leagues, but McCann is older and had 2 different IL stints last year. And the Orioles had a couple of different catchers that they ended up using. Sometimes it was Anthony Bemboom, who would come up and be the backup while McCann was on the IL. Now, luckily for the O's, McCann, it was 2 10-day IL stints, and he was pretty much off the IL within 2 weeks each time, so it wasn't super long stints, but Bemboom served as a solid backup, and Bemboom, who was the backup for the O's early in 2022 before Adley actually came up to the big league, so he had been with the O's system for a little bit, and they liked him and his defense. And Bemboom has signed elsewhere. He's got a minor league deal with the Tigers this offseason, probably a better shot at big league playing time, which is why he left the O's organization. But I really liked Anthony Bemboom because he was such a good third catcher, right? Yeah, he wasn't a good hitter, but he had a nice looking swing from the left side, and he got a couple of hits in key moments for the Orioles over the last 2 years. And what he was a good defender, a veteran who had been around, popping around AAA and the big leagues. He was good with the AAA pitching staff. He was good with the big league pitching staff when he worked with them. Anthony Bemboom is kind of your perfect third catcher who you stick in AAA for most of the year, and you can bring him up for a bit if there's an injury. That role has been vacated. The Orioles already signed Danny Banuelos to a minor league deal earlier this offseason, but he's a catcher who has never been in the big leagues. He's been in AA and AAA, but I don't want him at this point to be, to me, the third catcher, a guy who doesn't have big league experience. And the other option would be a guy like Maverick Handley. And Maverick Handley is the guy who, the Orioles have tried to at least prop up as, hey, he could be that future backup catcher. But Handley is kind of stalled out a little bit because of injury and just underperforming at the plate. He's kind of stuck in AAA Norfolk at the moment, although he is just an elite defensive catcher for the O's. And for me, that means Michael Perez kind of becomes a solid fill-in for Anthony Bemboom as the Orioles' third catcher going into next year, as long as he is okay with starting the year in AAA Norfolk and kind of splitting the duties with Handley for the catching responsibilities in Norfolk and being ready as that third catcher, being that new Anthony Bemboom. Because the good thing about Perez is, although the bat has just not really shown anything in the big league since 2020, he's still been a solid defensive catcher. Overall, in framing ability, he's been, I'd say, slightly below average in his time there. I mean, that's not the worst you can do. Blocking wise, he's great. StatCast has its new blocking stat. I mean, he is an incredible blocker of the baseball. He's in the 90th percentile right there. And then his arm and his throwing ability, again, average-ish, essentially, along with his framing. So it's a solid defensive profile. It's a veteran who's been in the big leagues. And it's a guy who, you're bringing him in to be the third catcher. You're not relying on him unless there's an injury. If there's an injury to McCann at any point this year, I think Perez would be the guy. A couple weeks as him as the backup, plays a couple of times, perfectly fine with that. If there's an injury to Adley at any point, which would be a nightmare scenario for the O's, but if it happens, You probably are looking for outside help, right? Like McCann, if it's a long-term injury, you're probably looking for a starting catcher for a year. If it's a short-term injury, maybe you do go with McCann as the starter and Perez as the backup as well. But it gives you nice depth to have that Ben Boom gave the O's. And guys like Mark Colesbury and Luis Torrens and others also gave the O's, Robinson Chirinos too, over the past few years. But Perez is kind of like low ceiling for a minor league signing, right? You're just bringing him in for depth and a just-in-case option, essentially. The other name they brought in could have a little more upside because there's a little more to look at here for right-handed pitcher Albert Suarez. And we'll talk a bit about him coming up after the break. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Gametime. Now, you've maybe had frustrating experiences, I'm sure, buying tickets in the past. There are so many different apps. Some of them are confusing. There's a million fees. You weren't sure if your seats are good. You can't find the last minute tickets. Well, listen, you shouldn't have to worry when you're buying tickets to the next big event. Gametime is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. With killer last minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. They've got last-minute tickets on the app. They've got flash deals, zone deals, so you save even more money on the app. And they've got their lowest price guarantee, which is even a better saver. And Gametime, they've got deals on tickets right up to the start of the event. I have literally bought tickets on Gametime standing outside of Utah Street and then walked into the stadium because they get sent right to the app on your phone and you can go in. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON. That's LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So we're talking about a couple of Orioles minor league signings on today's episode and want to continue on with a right-handed pitcher that the Orioles have brought in to the system here. And this is a little bit different than Michael Perez. Talked about Michael Perez as the catcher. He's going to be the third catcher for this Orioles team. The other signing that they made over the last week or so is right-handed pitcher Albert Suarez, who they brought in on a minor league deal. Now, Suarez is 34 years old, 6'3", 235-pound right-hander who has been in pro ball since 2008. He was signed as a international free agent signing by the Tampa Bay Rays out of Venezuela, and he started his pro ball in rookie ball all the way back in 2018 at age 18. Now, comes from a baseball family. His brother, Robert Suarez, is a reliever in the Padres bullpen, kind of high heat throwing reliever who was actually playing in Japan and having a lot of success from 2016 to 2021 before the Padres signed him. And that's where Albert Suarez was for a while as well. Now, he was in the Rays system and he was in there for 7 years and he never got past Double-A. And so the Rays let him go, got signed by the Angels for a year, never got past Double-A in 2015. And then he signs with the Giants in 2016, and the Giants give him his first chance at the big leagues. And between the 2016 and 2017 seasons with the San Francisco Giants, and that was including a 2016 team that went to the playoffs. Suarez now wasn't part of that playoff team, but he appeared in 40 games and made 12 starts over those 2 seasons with San Francisco. It wasn't anything special. It was a 4.51 ERA, about 7 strikeouts and 3 walks per 9. He was like a league average pitcher, essentially. But it kind of showed him, I don't know if I have a future in the big leagues. He was released by the Giants, signed by the Diamondbacks in 2018, but never made it out of AAA. And after that 2018 season, Suarez said, look, my brother Robert is over in Japan. He is thriving as a pitcher that's dominating over there. Maybe I can have the same fate for myself. So he went over to Japan, was signed by an MPB team in 2019, and pitched for 3 years over in Japan. And in those 3 years, he, in 40 games, had a 3.00 ERA. Again, just about 7 strikeouts and 3 walks per 9. It was very similar, strikeout and walk numbers, but a much better ERA over in Japan than he had in the majors, and spent 3 years there. And although he was good, he never became like an ace of a staff, never became a big-time starter. And then he went to the KBO. And this is where he kind of took another step forward. And listen, KBO, I think most people would say, is probably league number 3 in the world. MLB is number 1, NPB in Japan number 2, and then KBO is definitely a step down from NPB. But in KBO, he was great. He spent the last 2 years with the Samsung Lions in the KBO and made 48 starts on the mound over those past 2 years, threw just under 300 innings in those 2 years combined, and had a 3.04 ERA with about 8 strikeouts per 9. Not great, but solid. And right around 2 walks per 9, which is really good command. Also had about a 65% ground ball rate over those 2 years with the Samsung Lions. And I know it's a little easier sometimes for a big league pitcher to go to KBO, but in general, I mean, that's a really high ground ball rate. He's using a fastball and a sinker to kind of a naturally sinking fastball to keep the ball on the ground. But his arsenal over in the KBO and what you would think he's coming to MLB with looks like this. He's a big-time fastball guy, 51% fastballs, throws about 93 miles per hour on average, up to 94, 95 over in the KBO. Then it was 22% sliders and 84 mile per hour, more typical slider, 21% changeups that he'll use against lefties as well. And then he had a curveball, a bigger, kind of slower hook that he threw about 7% of the time over in the KBO. A very general 4-pitch starter mix. But what I will tell you, what we have good data on is the pitches he threw in 2016 and 2017 in the big leagues with the Giants. And again, that was at this point 6-7 plus years ago. He is a different pitcher now at age 34 after pitching in Asia for 5 years. Like, he's a very different guy. But when he was in the big leagues, and he still throws a version of this slider that he was throwing then, that was an elite slider that he was throwing. I mean, opponents were hitting under 200 against it. And in 2017, he pitched a little less in 17 than he did in 16 with the Giants. But in 2017, Suarez had a 54% whiff rate on his slider. To put that into context, that is a higher whiff rate, or a whiff rate, I should say, right around what Félix Bautista's splitter has. And it feels like anytime Félix throws his splitter, the hitter's going to swing and miss. It's very close to what Suarez had on his slider back in 2017 with the Giants. So if I had to guess, okay, what do the Orioles see here from a 34-year-old who hasn't pitched in Major League Baseball in over 6 years, that slider and the ability to pitch a lot of innings over the last few years is probably what the Orioles saw. Now, again, I feel like, unfortunately, I have to say this every single time I talk about an Orioles minor league signing. I think they're interesting. They provide depth. And a lot of times, a couple of these minor league signings will always appear for the big league team the next year to give some depth. You know, guys get injured. Maybe they're a breakout piece, whatever it may be. These guys do help your major league team, even though they are minor league signings. I cannot for the life of me, I say it every single time on this podcast I talk about minor league signings, I can't for the life of me understand why people get so worked up about minor league signings. Every single team, I guarantee you, all 30 teams in Major League Baseball have made at least one and probably a handful of minor league signings already this offseason. And it's only January 5th here. We still got, 6 weeks until pitchers and catchers report. And they make more of them generally at the end of free agency when, all the big names have finally signed. And then guys realize, oh, I was pushing for a major league deal. I actually might have to settle for a minor league deal. And you see a lot of them in February as well. So teams aren't even done with these. These are the lowest risk thing imaginable. And I don't understand, where is the logic not connecting for people when they're upset with a minor league signing and saying, oh, here go the Orioles again, being cheap, just going after these minor league guys. Every single team signs 5 to 10 players on minor league deals and sometimes more every offseason. There's no risk. You're not guaranteeing them any money. You're not guaranteeing them any roster spot. They don't end up on your active roster. They don't end up on your 40-man roster. All they do is come in as a minor league player who's basically making, every single one of them essentially makes less than $1 million, even if they make the team, and they're not making much money when they first come in. You invite them to spring training. You say, hey, we have a little bit of a hole in the major leagues at this level. We have maybe not the firmest player in that role, or we just have a lack of depth at this position at AAA. Let's bring you in. You can compete for a major league spot in big league spring training, but most likely, if you accept this role, you'll be our depth here at AAA. And if there's an injury in the big leagues, we can call you up. And it's generally guys that have some major league experience in the past. The O's are basically giving up nothing for these players. If they don't work out in spring training, it's not like you have to go through this big thing to cut them. You just let them free and they go and find another minor league deal elsewhere. It happens to player all of the time. There is no risk here. This is not the O's being cheap. Every single team does that. Look at the Dodgers. They probably got 1 million minor league signing guys who come in just for depth, just in case one of these guys hits. Now, do I think Albert Suarez or Michael Perez are going to hit? Probably not. Again, Perez is your third catcher, which is an important thing to have. People say you need a good backup catcher to be in there. We've seen how much better the O's were when they upgraded from Robinson Chirinos to James McCann as Adley's backup. You also need a good third catcher because catching is a tough job and catchers get injured a lot because it's rough back there. And a good third catcher is always nice to be able to call on a guy from AAA who has big league experience to plug in as your backup for a few weeks if you need to. It's also good to have pitching depth. And when you look at the AAA Norfolk rotation, in terms of a guy like Albert Suarez, he's going to start the year in AAA Norfolk. Unless he completely wows in spring training, I would think he knows he's going to Norfolk to start the year. Now he's going to try to get to the big leagues at some point. But you're looking at a AAA rotation of Chase McDermott, Cade Povich, Justin Armbruster, Garrett Stallings, and then there's kind of a question after that because you have a lot of other guys with some injuries and some poor performances over the last few years. And there was a question mark about like, okay, who is even Norfolk's fifth starter? And that's not even close to the importance of who Baltimore's fifth starter is right now. But you need that depth. You need those innings at AAA. And at the absolute very least, Albert Suarez, not saying he's going to be the number 5 starter, but he rounds out your Norfolk Tides rotation. And then you throw in, guys like Ryan Watson and potentially if Brandon Young is back healthy and other guys who are making their way back to AAA like a Kyle Branovich and guys like that. You throw those guys in together and you piecemeal a rotation. That is usually a 6-man rotation is what they do in AAA Norfolk. But Suarez is a guy who's 34 and okay, we can send him out there once a week. He'll throw us 6 to 7 innings. At the very least, he's not like blocking prospect innings. He's going to help us get through a AAA season. And if we need to, and if we like the stuff, maybe he helps us at some point at the big league level. Again, it's no risk. It doesn't say anything about the team. Is John Angelo's cheap? Yes, but it's not because they're signing players to minor league deals. Every single team does it, and it is always a smart investment to bring in depth. You can never have enough depth, and that's basically, at the end of the day, what these signings are. We got a few more news and notes to get to before we wrap up the podcast. O's made a different kind of minor league signing as well that I wanted to talk about. We're going to talk about the numbers some of the young Orioles got in the pre-arbitration bonus pool that I haven't gotten to yet. And then we did get a little more, just a little nugget more about Dylan Cease from Ken Rosenthal on Friday. Talk about that to finish off the podcast coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. Now, the NFL regular season is wrapping up, and the Ravens, they're not really playing people tomorrow against the Steelers because they got it all locked up, the number 1 seat. But there's still time for you to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's number 1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets, guaranteed, when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The app is so easy to use, and there's so many different ways to bet, like live same-game parlays. You can find your bets in the new Explore tab. You can make a parlay in the Parlay Hub, which is the best way to find popular parlays, and you can do so much more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup at FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. So we're back here on an Orioles news and notes episode to finish up today's show. I want to talk about a few more things. Now, I was talking about 2 minor league signings that the Orioles made in the catcher Michael Perez and the right-hander in Albert Suarez, but they made another signing a couple of days ago, which is a little bit different version of a minor league signing, but they brought in another right-handed pitcher in Dominic Freeberger. Freeberger, though, technically would be a minor league signing, but really what he is an extended undrafted free agent from the MLB draft last July. So who is Dominic Freeberger? Well, he is a two-way player out of UConn who was the 2023 Big East Conference Player of the Year at UConn. He was their main third baseman and also did a little bit of pitching and ended up hitting .346 with a .913 OPS as a right-handed hitter at UConn in the spring. The issue with Freeberger was a couple of things. Well, probably 3 things. One, he was a 5th-year senior. He had played 4 years at UNC Asheville. He had graduated, grad transferred to UConn for a year. And while he was literally the player of the year in not a very good baseball conference, but still an okay Division I baseball conference and a really, really good program in UConn. He was older. He didn't have that projectability. And although he hit for average, he doesn't hit for a crazy amount of power, especially with the amount of home runs that are in the game in college baseball right now. It's not as much a part of his game offensively. He's a right-handed hitter, and he doesn't play up the middle, right? He's like a third baseman, first baseman / left fielder instead of a shortstop, a center fielder, a catcher, what you're looking to draft. The other thing was probably, I think he was looking to make a move to the mound. So he doesn't get drafted in the 20-round draft. Not only that, he does not get signed as an undrafted free agent right after the draft. Generally, each team will bring in, 3, 4, 5, 6 players who weren't drafted and give them minimum contracts coming after the draft to give them a chance in the minors as well. He didn't even get yet that. And I have to think it was because he was trying to make that full transition into a pitcher. Now, for all 5 of his college baseball seasons for Freeberger, he did some pitching. So he was always considered a two-way player at the college level. And if you're not familiar with college baseball, two-way players are a lot more common. Pretty much every college baseball team, I would say, at least has one guy who at the very least does a little bit of pitching along with being like an important hitter in the starting lineup. And some teams, especially smaller schools, have a couple of guys who are two-way guys. Like, hey, our second best bullpen arm is, also our left fielder. Like that's something that'll happen solid amount of time at smaller schools in Division I college baseball as well. So it's not like MLB where Shohei Ohtani's the guy. It is a little more usual at the college baseball level. Now, Freeberger, I mentioned he was at UNC Asheville. He was a great hitter there. He was even better when he came to UConn. But the Orioles announced the signing, and UConn announced the signing as well, that they signed Freeberger as an undrafted free agent / minor league free agent as a right-handed pitcher instead of as a third baseman / outfielder, what he was known for at UConn. And he only pitched in 6 games at UConn this spring, 5 1/3 innings, 3 runs, 6 hits, 7 Ks, and 1 walk. I mean, solid numbers, but again, it's 6 appearances on the mound. Not sure going to take a lot from that. But again, he did pitch a little bit, at least, all 4 years at UNC Asheville. So in his 5 years of college total on the mound, 34 1/3 innings, did have 5 saves, 6.29 ERA, about 9 Ks per 9, but 6 walks per 9 is concerning. However, in his senior year at UNC Asheville in 2022, he only pitched 11 2/3 innings, but he did strike out 14, and opponents hit just 081 against the right-hander that year. Now, there's not a lot of info I could find about like what the stuff looks like, but what I'm guessing here is Freeberger didn't get drafted and just said, all right, I'm going to be a pitcher. And he took essentially the last 4 or 5 months to work on his pitching and show that he's not a hitting prospect. He is a pitching prospect, and he's a much better pitching prospect than he was hitting prospect. The O's saw that, and oh yeah, there is a little bit of a connection here. Freeberger's from Baltimore. He played at Calvert Hall over in Towson, then went to Asheville, then to UConn. So I'm not sure, but I'm thinking he may have grown up as an Orioles fan as well, which has got to be a cool moment for him. So he comes in essentially as an addition to the Orioles 2023 draft class. Again, that most likely means he'll, maybe go to extended spring training and then end up either in the FCL or potentially Delmarva to start 2024. Like he's a ways away from the big leagues, obviously, but it's an interesting case. Mostly you pick up these guys right around the draft. It's interesting to see this signing happen in January. It makes me kind of intrigued. Like, what did he work on becoming, a pitcher only and really focusing on like what did that unlock that the Orioles were interested? I'm very intrigued to learn more about that. Another thing I wanted to touch on is just the pre-arbitration bonus pool. Now, these numbers came out a month or more ago, but I don't think I ever got to them on the podcast. What the pre-arbitration bonus pool is, it's something that was created in the new CBA, which was enacted for the 2022 season, that sets aside a total of $50 million that is given to the best pre-arbitration players in the big leagues. Now, I've talked about how arbitration works. Essentially, when you come up to the big leagues, you have 3 years where you are pre-arbitration. You are essentially making around the league minimum for 3 years. And then when you hit arbitration, you can start to make some real money for your 4th, 5th, and 6th seasons in the big leagues. But there was an issue with these players, these star players in their first 3 years in the bigs, just not making any money at all. So one of the things the union was able to negotiate is this pre-arbitration bonus pool. $50 million sits there, gets split among a bunch of players who perform well in their first 3 seasons, but have not yet hit arbitration. And while there were a lot of players who got money, 4 Orioles finished in the top 8 in this pre-arb bonus pool. I believe it is figured out. It's like a combination. It's some sort of war that is made up by MLB itself, and it's kind of an in-house number. It includes FanGraphs, it includes Baseball Reference, but it tries to encapsulate all total performance. Adley Rutschman finished third. He was awarded $1.8 million. Kyle Bradish finished sixth, was awarded $1.66 million. Félix Bautista was seventh at $1.47 million. And Gunnar Henderson was eighth and got $1.43 million. So although none of those four guys, despite the fact that I would love for it to happen, are, I think, going to get or getting or close to getting contract extensions from John Angelos and the Orioles, this is what exactly this pre-arb bonus pool is for. It's for teams like the Orioles who have all these talented young players and an owner not willing to extend or pay more money to any of them. This bonus pool kind of worked exactly like it should this year in that it rewarded the young players on the Orioles by giving them a little extra dough, which is certainly cool to see. And then I got to finish up with this. Maybe I'm saving the best for last for some of you, but Ken Rosenthal wrote a piece in The Athletics, one of his notes columns on Friday, and it was basically titled, "The Latest on What I'm Hearing About the Dylan Cease Trade Rumors." And I got to be honest, it was mostly about the Yankees. We hadn't heard a lot about the Yankees being interested in Cease, but Rosenthal was mostly writing about how the Yankees are now seen as one of the front runners. They're a lot more interested in trying to trade for Dylan Cease, despite the fact that they've already traded for Juan Soto. They feel like they still have enough to go get Cease. But the one thing that Rosenthal did say, besides talking about how, the Orioles should be the front runners, they have all the pieces to get him, everything that everybody writes about and talks about Dylan Cease and the O's, the one line that was nice said, "The Orioles and the Yankees are the two teams expressing, quote, sincere interest in Dylan Cease." He didn't say a lot more about the O's, but he basically put the Yankees and the Orioles in one category of they're talking with the White Sox and they have the most sincere interest. You can take with that what you will, but at least it's a positive sign of the Orioles trying to go and get Dylan Cease. We don't exactly know still what the exact asking price is. We had heard, those big asking prices from the Reds, but the Reds GM, Nick Krall, said last week, hey, we're pretty much done making big moves this offseason, so they're probably out of the Dylan Cease sweepstakes. After the Braves went and got Chris Sale, they might be out. And, after the Dodgers getting Ohtani and Yamamoto, they might not be out, but maybe they are. So maybe it comes down to Orioles versus Yankees for Dylan Cease. What a matchup that would be. And of course, we'll keep you updated on all the Dylan Cease news as it continues to come out throughout this offseason. But that'll do it for us here this week. And thank you for tuning in. Make sure to leave a 5-star rating and a review wherever you listen. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube page as well. And we still do have our 2023 year in review survey. I will link the survey in the notes description for this episode on audio and on YouTube as well. It asks you some questions about your favorite moments for the Orioles this year, but it also asks you for feedback on this podcast. And please, 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 if you have not already, check the description of this episode, grab that link and fill out that. You can talk about what you like about the pod, what could be improved, how you found the podcast, and your thoughts on the Orioles this year. It doesn't take too long to fill out, and I would really, really appreciate your response on that survey as well. We will be back on Monday. It's a Mailbag Monday episode, so get those questions in. You can put them right here in the YouTube comments or email us at lockedonorioles@gmail.com with those mailbag questions, and we will answer them when I return on Monday. Of course, you see the background right here behind me. Still haven't moved yet. As I've mentioned, I'm in the process of moving, doing it next week. All the Orioles stuff that's usually behind me is packed away, so that's why the white wall is back there. And just to let you know, it'll still be there when I'm back for the mailbag on Monday. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.